IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello, this is All Things Policy. This is Monday and we talk about China today. I am Sankalp and I have with me Suyash and Pranav. Today we are going to talk about China's first nuclear test in 1964. The context for this is this test completed about 55 years this October. Also, in the weekend at Takshashila we hosted Global No First Use Conference. So, we start with Suyash. Suyash, tell us about the history of China's nuclear weapons and the context behind this.
So hi Sankalp. So China exploded its nuclear bomb in 1964.
First nuclear bomb
In 1964. China became nuclear in 1964. But the process started in 1952, formally in 1955. So Mao realized that in 1952 that due to the US can attack China, there was a pressure during the Korean War. There was a pressure of You
mean nuclear blackmail?
There was a nuclear blackmail by US on China during the Korean War. But China was not capable of having its own nuclear. China didn't have the technology, nor did it had uranium at that period of time. So, first time uranium was found in China in 1954, and the process started fastening. It went on fast track, and formally under Chou En-lai's leadership, directly under Chou En-lai, the process of nuclearization of China started in 1955, which led to 1964 of the nuclear blast.
Okay. So I had read somewhere that Russia had helped China in the initial phases of nuclear development. Could you tell us?
1961-62. So from 1955 to 1953 to 1960, extraction of uranium and joint exploration happened under Russia and China till 1960. But 1960 is when 1961 and 1962 the relations between China and Russia went on
basically
opposite
Khrushchev
side.
and Mao
Yes,
were
opposed to each other. And abruptly all the technology supply was stopped in 1962. And that is when China, but by that time China had already had a great help from Russia, and which led to furthermore, it took 2 more years for China to do nuclearization.
So interestingly, China attacked India in October 62 and they tested their weapons in October 64. So was there any sort of relation in these two dates or any of that?
It is for India, not for China. China had already planned of nuclearization in 1960s, before 1960s. But for India, the immediate response, because of China war and then 1964 nuclearization, India then decided to go for nuclear exposure.
So could you tell us more about Chinese nuclear policy?
So there is amazing consistency in Chinese nuclear policy. First, we should differentiate between policy and strategy. Strategy is placement, withdrawal, strike capability, etc. Policy is a broader policy framework. Chinese nuclear policy has been consistent since 1960, since the first nuclear explosion happened. They have not changed it till date. It is second strike basically. China says that it will only use nuclear against a nuclear country if they are attacked.
China subscribes to no first
use policy
and nuclear non-use against non-nuclear weapons.
Yes.
Basically.
So no first use policy and nuclear use only against the nuclear states.
Adversaries.
If attacked by nuclear states, by nuclear arms. And also there is a tight civilian control on Chinese nuclear policy, which is quite different from their conventional arms policy, because yes, there is a Communist Party control, civilian control over the military, but military has also been responsible for initiating debates and dialogues whenever there is a change in policy or if a new strategy is adopted. But in case of nuclear, civilians are completely in control. Only 5 leaders, the policy of 7 leaders in the Politburo Standing Committee and their head leader. So they were responsible for nuclear policy. And
so you mean these are all members of Central Military Commission? No, not
No,
necessary.
CPC Standing Committee.
CPC Standing Committee. Okay, fine.
And CMC was brought in fact, CMC was brought in later when rocket forces were formed. Rocket Force was initially called a Second Artillery Corps, which was formed
So that is basically PLAAF.
No, that is PLARF, Rocket Force.
Okay.
So initially, that's an interesting story. So Second Artillery Corps was formed after nuclear explosion, after China became nuclear.
Okay.
In 1964, 1965, under Chow Enlai's, or if I'm not wrong, in 1962, I'll have to look at it. But it was formed in 1960s and under the leadership of Chow Enlai.
Okay.
So Chow Enlai overnight called the head of a CMC member to his house and then created the Secondary Artillery Corps, which later got converted into full service status into Rocket Force after Xi's reform.
Interestingly, China tested weapons in 64. India had capacity by then, but India didn't test its weapons. So the benefit that China got because of this was that China became nuclear non-proliferation treaties only nuclear weapon power, one of those 5 actually.
That's a different story altogether, but India could have been one if it had signed and not declared itself nuclear instead of saying peaceful nuclear.
Interestingly, China continued to test weapons till 96 and then China went on to sign CTBT.
Yes.
But India did not sign. And the reason I'm bringing India in basically is because our audience is primarily Indian, and also because for China as well as for India, weapon strategy, policies of both of these countries matter to each other.
Yes.
All said and done.
And there is a stark similarity between their approaches to nuclear policy.
Do you think India borrowed from China basically?
No, I'm not making any of those claims, but I'm just saying there is a stark similarity because there is a strict civilian control. I'll give you a Chinese example.
No, even in case of no first use.
First use, yes. So I'll give you an example. So the control is such that there was an ambiguity regarding China's nuclear policy till 2004 or 2006, because it was only coming out on the statements of the leaders. So Deng Xiaoping made a statement, Mao made some statement, Chow Enlai made some statement.
So you're talking about 2004 when China came out basically with their nuclear doctrine?
No. So they came out with their defense white paper.
Okay.
And in their defense white paper 2004 or 2006, first time there was a broad, elaborate nuclear vision or nuclear strategy of China. And that has been consistent till date.
Okay. Pranav, you were going to tell us something about 2004 onwards developments, right? Something that China has managed to do. Could you tell us some background regarding the size of weapons, missiles, and
Yeah, so very interesting. The Chinese philosophy of nuclear weapons was very different from what the superpowers had. The superpowers had very, very large number of arsenals. In fact, it went to about 40,000 by the time China had tested its first nuclear weapon. We know that this period is a very shaky one. China had just come out of a massive economic crisis and you had a lot of political issues. And around this time, China was scarce of resources. So because of China's poverty at that time and because of Mao's thought about nuclear weapons being of no use in war fighting, he called it paper tigers, were weapons which are just political tools with no war fighting ability. And his initial thought really shaped how China perceived its nuclear arsenal, which is the reason why China maintains what it calls a lean, effective arsenal. And even for them, when we talk about deterrence, they don't use the word deterrence. In the Chinese language, they use a word called weishi. But it's difficult to define what weishi is because it's something related about defense. It's about defending your country, defending your territory rather than deterring someone from aggression. So the Chinese thought was they would have a lean, effective arsenal which would only be used to deter aggression and to stop other countries from coercing China.
Okay, so that was basically no first use as well as second strike capability and credible deterrence.
Yes. And for a very long time, till even 2007, 2008, China maintained an extremely small arsenal with double digits. In 2007, 2008, they had...
No, but I had read somewhere that there were some wild expectations and accusations that China had some about 3,000 nuclear...
Oh yes, that's a very, very funny story which I will come to.
Okay. Or maybe you can tell us now.
I will come to that. But so China had a very, very small arsenal. This is primarily because they had scarcity of resources. And secondly, they feared a lot about, not about the size of their arsenal, but rather its survivability. What China always worried about is that because they have no first use, they should have a guaranteed second strike capability. And having a second strike capability means that you need to protect those small number of weapons you have from an American or an adversary's counterforce targeting, which means they have the ability to take out your nuclear weapons before you can even launch them. So the Chinese were primarily worried about securing their arsenal. And over the years, what we have seen is a rapid growth in the Chinese arsenal. Right now, they have just over 250 nuclear weapons. And this is a significant growth. And
so I think amongst P5 countries, China maintains the lowest number of nuclear force?
Yes, China maintains the lowest number of nuclear forces. And you mentioned that the estimates of 3,000 nuclear weapons.
Some US think tank came out with that figure.
It was not a US think tank. It was actually an adjunct professor from Georgetown University. So he and a bunch of master's students went through open source archives, and they even went through Chinese propaganda films. And they predicted that China has a vast underground network of tunnels. They have very, very large uranium capacity.
That was realized after the earthquake of 2007.
Yes, and also after that, China produced television shows where they partly showed the tunnel network. While China does have a
shady tunnel network.
Yeah, it's not shady at all. While China has a tunnel network, the 3,000 nuclear weapons estimate was very, very wild, and they considered a waste of time. So one of the joke was that the professor not only wasted his time, but he also wasted the valuable time of his students.
Okay, interesting.
So,
Suyash?
Interestingly, what happened after that is that China in the more recent years has been rapidly increasing its arsenal. It's not rapid in the sense that you have hundreds of weapons being deployed, but you have in slow increments.
So are they competing with Pakistan?
Well, they're not competing with Pakistan.
Because Pakistan is also increasing its arsenal with a fast pace, right?
Yeah, but what China is more concerned about is survivability.
Okay.
And more recently, a more recent research shows that because China has this inability to use nuclear weapons first because of their philosophy, and Chinese really don't feel like using their nuclear weapons first, they're developing other conventional forms of aggression. So they have conventionally armed hypersonic missiles, very long range.
We will come to that, Pranav, because Suyash wants to say something. And
so interestingly, Pranav, you made a statement regarding second strike capability. There is a interesting anecdote about it. So China's three strike capability, that is the triad of deterrence, it's questionable. It was questionable till very recently because the philosophy,
so
the Chinese
triad is basically land, air, and naval assets.
Yes, for second strike capability. So because if you have a triad, then you have a second strike capability. So it is questionable. It was questionable till recently because since the formation of Chinese nuclear policy, the emphasis has been on rockets. So DF series and JL series. So
you mean DF,
Dongfeng, DF series. So DF series and JL series. So DF is land to surface to air, surface to air, surface to surface missiles, and JL is submarine based missiles, ICBM, which are used in ICBMs. So they have put a lot of emphasis on DF and JL, but delivery through. So it is highlighted in the statements of leadership, Chao En-lai statements, that delivery through air was not the priority for China.
Okay, so what was the priority then?
Surface to surface.
Okay.
Water
so that clearly shows that their priority in terms of threat perception was Soviet Union. Because if they wanted to focus on US, then they would have to have naval and air capabilities to be able to hit US targets.
They had submarine capability. They were developing submarine capabilities. So JL capabilities they were developing. But yes, their priority was immediate neighborhood. More than also Soviet Union, but Taiwan.
Okay. No, because interestingly, I had also read that China did not join NPT as such till 1992.
Yes.
So there is something to do with the Cold War politics and the overall threat perception with the Soviet Union. Otherwise, they would have joined it as soon as, say, NPT was signed.
And I would not agree with you when you say that US was not a priority, because the push for nuclear came because of US, because of nuclear blackmail.
No, but then the Cold War politics was changing, no? So in late 60s and early 70s, when Sino-Soviet tensions went up, US and China basically decided to collaborate against the Soviet threat.
Right.
And that is where I think the overall threat perception changed. Accordingly, their strategies also changed.
Right.
Although the doctrine and overall nuclear policy remained the same.
Right.
Interestingly, in the same period in 80s, China proliferated weapons technology to Pakistan. Pranav, you were telling something about China-Pakistan cooperation?
Well, yes, a lot of Pakistan's ballistic missile technology mainly is a derivative of Chinese DF-21s and DF-16s, DF-26s. They supplied a lot of parts. They invited Chinese engineers.
But it's not just ballistic missile, right? It's also about nuclear technology, right?
Oh, yeah.
So they say that
nuclear
even,
technology too.
China gave kind of stuff that nobody gives to other countries. I mean, Andrew Small has a fascinating chapter on China-Pakistan nuclear cooperation.
Yeah, exactly. So among all the P5 nuclear weapon states in the NPT, China is the only one which has sort of helped horizontal proliferation, which means that ensuring that more states have nuclear weapons. So there is some form of cooperation between Pakistan and China, and very little cooperation between China and North Korea. In fact, there's mistakenly people attribute North Korea's nuclear weapons to China, but North Korea did not receive much assistance at all. In fact, North Korea has the most indigenous nuclear weapons program ever, more indigenous than India or Pakistan.
But tell me something, how does North Korea fit into overall Chinese strategies? Because 2006 is when North Korea becomes nuclear weapon state. If not internationally recognized, then at least in terms of their capacities. And China has concerns about North Korean program, right? I think that is one of those areas where Chinese and Americans, I think, agree that North Korea should be denuclearized, right?
Yes, they do agree that, but the Chinese have a different view. In fact, if you remember, in 2015, they suggested something called freeze for freeze. So the US freezes all its tests, all its military exercises in that region. For exchange, North Korea would freeze its nuclear weapons testing and ballistic missile launches and so on.
So basically, North Korea does not figure into Chinese security calculations as much as...
It does, because North Korea obviously has the potential to escalate in the Korean Peninsula, which would ultimately result in, if there is a conflict, you would have a large number of refugees who would be crossing the Yalu River and going to China, right? And that's one of the most... worrying things.
Nightmare for China, basically.
Yeah, China, because having such a large influx of refugees, while at the same time increasing the American presence if there is a conflict. So for them, it's about managing this, managing this sort of irritant. Yeah. North Korea is basically an irritant in the security calculus.
Okay, just before we started this talk, you were telling me something about China's miniaturizing efforts. Could you tell us more about that?
Yeah, obviously, if you want to deliver a nuclear weapon by missiles, you have to make sure that all your components are miniaturized so that they can fit into a warhead. We don't know if China has fully developed its MIRV capabilities, which means...
MIRV is basically multiple independently launched re-entry vehicles.
Yeah, multiply independently targetable re-entry vehicles.
Okay.
So there is a doubt that whether China has successfully MIRVed its missiles. The DF-41, for example, they say that you can fit a maximum of 3 warheads, but the miniaturization in the design has not taken place to an extent like the Americans or the Russians, who can fit about 10 warheads on their missiles.
Interesting. So, while we are discussing about missiles, I'm reminded of the discussion about INF Treaty here. Because when America decided to actually pull itself out of the INF Treaty, Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, that was actually signed in 1987 between US and Soviet presidents, the reason was given that the Russians are violating the treaty, but it's actually targeted towards the Chinese, because China has developed during the last 30 years missiles which are exactly in the range of, which are banned by the INF treaty, from between 500 kilometers to 5,500 kilometers.
Mid-range missiles.
And
intermediate range
missiles. And basically, although the US rhetoric focuses on Russia, they have realized that their greatest threat comes from China. So in this context, US-South Korea cooperation, Japan having, it's not, if not weapon capacity, but at least they have a capacity to go nuclear if they want to. So how does this all fit in, East Asian security scenario? wherein South Korea decided to buy THAAD weapon systems from US. China decided to punish South Korea. So, it's an evolving posture of China as well, because I think China, as it becomes a great power, it has to rethink about the purpose of weapons as well, right?
Yeah, but you look at it, the INF treaty was basically a treaty of the Cold War. And after that, you had the Chinese essentially developing INF range missiles, which was very, very essential to the security, right? Because they worried about the local wars. That is the United States waging a limited war near the Chinese borders. So for that reason, intermediate range missiles were very important. But if you try bringing the Chinese into the INF treaty fold, what you would realize is that China essentially has zero nuclear weapons. Because under the INF treaty, each warhead should be fitted on each missile, which is counted as one unit, right? And the Chinese have this culture of demating their delivery systems and their warheads. So
that is basically to ensure that no missed targets or anything mishaps do not happen, right?
Not just that, it's also very conforming with the no first use treaty, that you will not be on a state of alertedness or readiness. You would keep your warheads separate, you would keep your delivery system separate. Only when there's a high tension would you bring them together.
Unlike US and Russia does.
Yeah.
So they are on the hair trigger alert, basically.
Yeah, and if you take the INF treaty and if you go by the INF treaty counting system, then China would have zero nuclear weapons because it keeps its warheads and delivery systems demated.
Which India also does the same.
Yeah, which India also does. So if you try to have an arms control agreement between the superpowers and China, you would have a very, very difficult problem to solve, because China firstly has such a small nuclear arsenal. With such a small nuclear arsenal,
so
and
there is no chance of basically bringing China in and re-signing the INF treaty as such in the present form, as you are saying, right?
Yeah, it is impossible. But what you could have is agreements on what not to target. So you could have confidence building measures, but not necessarily an arms control agreement, because they are on such different levels.
Okay.
The arsenal sizes, the delivery systems, the thought, the way each side thinks about nuclear weapons is so different that I believe diplomatically it's very difficult for them to sit in front of a table and try to come to a consensus.
Interesting. So as we are talking about coming to a consensus, I am reminded of the CTBT treaty negotiations, because when 96 was the year when they were discussing CTBT and China even signed it, China wanted to make sure that India's name will be put in the sort of, compulsory signatories of the CTBT, and that was a clear targeting of India by China. Although China goes for no first use and other stuff, this was a clear politico-diplomatic strategy aimed against India, which ruffled feathers in India, which was also of concern for us. And when in 1998 India tested its weapon, the country which was mentioned implicitly, if not explicitly, was China, basically.
Yeah,
Prime Minister Vajpayee.
So 96 is when the technology was transferred from 96, 95 Narasimha Rao to Vajpayee.
Yeah.
And 96 Vajpayee was about to trigger, but the government fell. So people were aware that there's something going to happen and it is targeted towards China, because our nuclear policy is because of the threat of China. So that's why China.
But interestingly, I always see this triad operating in South Asia, wherein, actually not South Asia, we can call it Southern Asia, wherein you have Pakistan, you have India, and then you have China. Two of these countries are friends of each other, all are nuclear weapons power, and they are all competing with each other for security. So, that competition, how does this play out? And, what do you see happening, Pranav?
This presents a very unique dilemma for India, because India not only has the task of deterring Pakistan but also deterring China. And with our doctrine of minimum credible deterrence or credible minimum deterrence, the question then remains, what is a minimum? Because we have a three-digit nuclear arsenal which is about 10 warheads less than what the Pakistanis have, and we have about 100 nuclear warheads less than what the Chinese have.
So that is a best estimate that you are sort of pointing
towards, yeah, well,
right?
based on international publications and estimates.
But the number of weapons do not necessarily signify the capacity as well as...
It does not signify the capacity, but it's an interesting thought on how India would see this. So what would be its main area of concern? One of the scholars, I think in the nuclear security scholarship, one thing that has not been studied widely is the India-China dynamic, because both states have no first use.
Yeah.
And both states have very, very similar nuclear doctrines. But the issue here is
and
that
they compete with each other as well.
the issue here is that China has gone far ahead with its development of strategic non-nuclear weapons, which could escalate into a nuclear level, right?
From Indian side.
From Chinese side.
From Chinese side.
Yeah, so what the Chinese would do is that they would use their non-nuclear strategic weapons to somehow escalate to a nuclear level.
So Pranav, interestingly, I think China can target all of India, but India cannot target all of China, right? That is what...
We can target most of China with our Agni 5. We have the
Agni 5,
capability.
which has not yet been deployed, right? Which
Yeah.
has just been tasted.
Yeah.
And we are also on the verge of developing Agni 6, right? Which is where they say would be an MIRV technology.
MIRV.
But we don't know how many MIRVs, right? MIRVing does basically
Okay,
means
so
that
I want to interrupt here, but tell me something about this is thought which is just coming to my mind is we're talking about MIRVs. What about tactical weapons? Does China think about tactical weapons? Nuclear weapons?
That's a very, very interesting story. In one of the dissertations that I was reading a few months ago, the Chinese really thought of building tactical nuclear weapons, including neutron bombs.
When?
In the 1970s and 80s, when after the crisis with the Soviet Union. But
when
then
their perception of security threat was to the highest level.
Yeah, and what happens is that Deng Xiaoping, during this time, feels that tactical nuclear weapons are very, very dangerous. Not only Deng Xiaoping, but also people in the military. They feel that once you use a tactical nuclear weapon, there is no way of controlling escalation. Because nuclear weapons they open doors to uncertainty, right? So once you use a tactical nuclear weapon, what guarantee do you have that the war will be kept limited? You can't have a limited nuclear war in the Chinese thinking. There's actually a new paper out about Chinese thinking on nuclear escalation, which I'm still reading. And
in the international security, right?
Yes, and that's very interesting because Chinese essentially did not develop tactical nuclear weapons because they thought that what's the point when if there is nuclear war to be broken out, then it would be in the strategic level altogether. And you cannot have any use of tactical nuclear weapons. And tactical nuclear weapons were non-conforming with the Chinese nuclear doctrine, which was no first use, minimum arsenal, and non-aggression against non-nuclear weapon state. And this is also related to what Mao said. Nuclear weapons are of no use in war fighting.
But interestingly, as Pranav is saying, nuclear weapons are of no use for warfighting is fine. But China somehow presents a very paradoxical case wherein it has a no first use doctrine, but it is miniaturizing its weapons, it is modernizing its weapon systems. China does not believe in aggression, especially against non-nuclear weapon states, but then China goes aggressive using conventional weapons. China does not produce tactical weapons, but then it is a good friend with Pakistan, which thinks of producing tactical weapons. So in a way, I think China is a very different and sort of interesting case study, right?
Yeah, China is, I mean, when the nuclear scholarship sort of started thinking about nuclear strategy, one thing that they didn't look at is the Chinese nuclear strategy. Chinese nuclear strategy for a very long time
because China was not a great power then.
Yeah, it was such a dilemma. It's like...
And nothing comes out of China, right?
Yeah.
So only that for looking at nuclear strategy, you need papers, published
source
statements.
information of sorts.
So first open source information came out in 2006. Before that, the Rocket Force, 2nd Artillery Corps had published a text which was only circulated within the force and service structure and CMC was in 1996.
Yeah, which was the Science of Second Artillery Campaigns.
Yeah.
When Western scholars got hold of this textbook, they started thinking about how Chinese would view this.
Okay.
And there's also an internal debate within Chinese military itself about how do you think about nuclear no first use. Okay. And some of the military generals sort of think about cases where you could use nuclear weapons first when your arsenal is under threat. For example, if somebody is launching a conventional attack against your nuclear arsenal, the survivability of your nuclear arsenal is under threat.
So that has always been a dilemma for all strategists, basically.
Yeah, but for the Chinese who adhere so much to no first use, when Western scholars got hold of this textbook and many other textbooks later, they really started to doubt China's no first use.
But this was only the discussion happening within the 2nd Artillery Corps. This was not a policy that came out.
It's not a policy that came out, but it was
scholarly debate
that was happening within the service.
But the problem was
a service then.
It also came out from the National Defense University, right? Because it came out from the National Defense University, and several other prominent generals were actually talking about this.
So final question, Suyash. 2015, China is going for military modernization and reforms. Do they refer anything towards nuclear policy modernization, nuclear policy reforming? Any references are there? Could you?
The policy has been consistent.
Okay.
There is no change in the policy per se. After even when Hu Jintao or the current president has taken over, Xi Jinping has taken over, but they have upgraded, as I have already mentioned, they have upgraded 2nd Artillery Corps, which was their service responsible for nuclear, into PLA Rocket Forces.
Okay.
And Rocket Forces is in charge completely into a full service status. And they are basically in charge of nuclear which they
weapons.
Were in charge
since
the beginning.
But the key takeaway is that China does not believe in nuclear war fighting, but China wants to maintain credible minimum deterrence like India. Basically.
The policy has been the same
since 64.
64.
Interesting. So that's it. Thank you, Suyash. Thank you, Pranav. Do visit our website, which we have sort of unveiled last week on Global No First Use. Why don't you guys tell us about your Twitter handles, and Suyash comes out with his newsletter, so maybe that can be referred.
My Twitter handle is Suyash_Desai, and I write a weekly newsletter on Chinese People's Liberation Army. It is called the PLA Insight.
And my Twitter handle is Pran_S.
Yeah. Pranav is our resident nuclear expert, so do follow him on Twitter and do listen to All Things Policy. Thank you.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
How many times have you caught yourself Googling stuff on health and wondering if it's the right information? How many times have you heard different health experts give opposing views, which has only left you confused? There are rising cases of cancer, heart, diabetes, stress, and autoimmune diseases. Meet the patients and the experts who paved the path of true healing. Join me, Rachna Chachi, cancer nutrition coach and nutritional therapist on Heal and Hearty. I take you through my own journey of recovery from an incurable disease and the journey of so many others who healed only via nutrition and holistic healing. Find the answers you seek for what's good for your health and what's good for your soul. You can listen to us on the IVM Podcast app or ivmpodcast.com. Don't forget your date with good health.
Hey guys, this is me, Eva Bhatt, your host for the podcast 9XM Soundcast. This podcast is produced by India's largest music network, 9X Media. We have been catering music and you have been enjoying. And now we bring you a podcast where music inspires. Every week, I interact with some of the best minds from the music industry to understand their creative discipline. Every new episode will feature artists who will share inspiring notes from their journey, some valuable tips for budding artists. So do subscribe to the podcast where music inspires. Enjoy a brand new episode of 9XM Soundcast every Tuesday on IVM Podcast app or website or wherever you get your podcast from.